Most people watching Shedeur Sanders are watching the wrong thing. They are tracking the quarterback competition in Cleveland. They are debating whether he wins the starting job. They are arguing about draft position and early career statistics, and whether the media coverage has been fair. All of that is real, and all of it matters in its own context. But while that conversation dominates the surface level of every platform covering him, something else is happening underneath it that is significantly more important for understanding where Shedeur Sanders is actually going and what he is actually building. He is not trying to become the highest-paid quarterback in NFL history. He is trying to become an NFL owner. And the financial architecture he has been quietly constructing since his NIL era at Colorado is more sophisticated, more deliberate, and more strategically advanced than almost anyone covering him has stopped to examine closely. Today, we examine it closely, because this is the most important financial story in professional sports right now, and it deserves the full picture. Let us start with the framing, because the framing is everything when you are trying to understand a financial strategy that operates on a 10 to 15-year horizon, rather than on the quarterly timeline that most sports media coverage operates within. Shedeur Sanders made a statement that deserves to be heard with full attention and full seriousness. He said he is the most guaranteed risk you could take. He said the spotlight has always been there and the pressure has always been there, and it cannot get bigger than what he has already navigated. He said he is rooted by everything he has seen and experienced, by the flashbacks to the inner city and not knowing that the position he is in today was possible. And then he said something that tells you everything about the scale of what he is actually pursuing. He is not thinking about salary. He is thinking about ownership. He is thinking about royalty streams. He is thinking about building something that generates value long after the last snap of his playing career has been taken. That is a fundamentally different orientation than the one most NFL quarterbacks bring to their financial lives. The standard model is simple and understandable. Maximize your playing career earnings. Invest conservatively. Transition into broadcasting or coaching or the kind of post-playing career that keeps you connected to the sport without the physical demands. That model produces comfortable retired athletes with significant net worth and exactly zero structural leverage in the business of professional football. Shedeur is operating from a different model entirely. He is treating his playing career not as the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation, but as the platform that generates the commercial value that funds the investment architecture that eventually produces the ownership position. The playing career is the engine. The destination is the boardroom. And the road between those 2 points is being built right now through financial instruments and structural arrangements that most people covering him are not equipped to analyze or even recognize. 3 things need to be established before the full picture makes sense. First, Shedeur's commercial deals are not endorsements in the traditional sense. They are royalty agreements, and the difference between those 2 things is not a technicality. It is the entire strategy. Second, he is running his commercial operations through a private holding structure that the NFL's current ownership bylaws were not specifically written to address. Third, there is a gap in the NFL's ownership eligibility rules that is narrower than most people realize but more powerful than anyone is currently discussing publicly. All 3 of those things connect into a single coherent strategy. Understanding each one separately is necessary before the strategy as a whole becomes visible. Here is the foundational distinction that makes everything else in this analysis possible, and without which the entire strategy collapses into something that sounds impressive, but does not actually differentiate Shedeur from every other athlete who has tried and failed to build lasting financial power through commercial relationships. The traditional endorsement deal works as follows. A brand identifies an athlete whose image and platform align with their marketing objectives. They pay that athlete a negotiated flat fee for the right to use his name and likeness for a defined period under defined conditions. The athlete receives the payment. The brand receives the rights. The contract has an end date, And when that end date arrives, the income from that relationship stops unless both parties agree to renew under new terms. That structure is clean and understandable, and it has been the dominant model for athlete-commercial relationships for decades. It is also fundamentally limiting in a specific way that most athletes never fully reckon with. Your income from an endorsement deal is determined entirely at the moment the deal is signed. The brand pays you what they agreed to pay you, and however the product performs in the market, however the content resonates with consumers, however the commercial relationship ultimately benefits the brand over the life of the agreement, none of that upside flows back to you. You rented your brand for a fixed price. If the brand made 10 times what they paid you because your image drove exceptional commercial performance, that excess value belongs entirely to them. You were compensated for access, not for outcomes. Shedeur's commercial structure, starting from his NIL era at Colorado and continuing through his professional career, operates differently at the foundational level. He has been structuring his commercial relationships as royalty agreements rather than flat-fee licenses. Under a royalty structure, the compensation is not fixed at the moment of signing. It is calculated as a percentage of the ongoing revenue generated by products, content, and commercial activity that carries his intellectual property, his name, his likeness, his brand identity. Every unit of a product sold, every stream of content counted, every piece of commercial material distributed. Each one of those events generates a payment back to Shedeur calculated as his agreed percentage of the revenue that event produced. The implications of that structural difference are significant and compound over time in ways that flat-fee deals never can. First, the income does not have an expiration date tied to the contract period in the same way endorsement income does. The royalty continues as long as the commercial activity continues, and the products bearing his intellectual property continue generating revenue. Second, the income scales with the commercial success of the products and content he is associated with rather than being capped at whatever the brand was willing to pay at the time of negotiation. If a product takes off and generates significantly more revenue than projected, Shedeur's royalty income from that product takes off with it. Third, and most importantly for the ownership thesis we are building toward, royalty income is categorized differently from salary income in the financial structures that govern high-value asset acquisition. That categorization difference is where the ownership pathway actually lives. Now we get into the structural layer that most people covering Shedeur Sanders are not examining, because it requires understanding financial architecture rather than football performance, and most sports media operates firmly in the latter category. The royalty income being generated across his commercial portfolio does not flow directly to Shedeur as personal income in the way that an endorsement check does. It flows through a private holding company that he has structured to serve as the vehicle for accumulating, deploying, and compounding the commercial value his platform generates. A private holding company is a legal entity that owns assets and income streams on behalf of its principals. The holding company receives income, makes investment decisions, holds equity positions in other entities, and manages the overall financial architecture in ways that a personal income structure cannot. The advantages of operating through a holding company rather than as an individual are significant across multiple dimensions. Tax efficiency in how income is categorized and deployed. Liability protection that separates the individual from the financial risks of the investments the entity makes. Structural flexibility in how equity positions are organized and documented. And critically for what Shedeur is building, the ability to hold passive investment positions in other entities in ways that are legally and organizationally distinct from his status as an active NFL player. That last dimension is where the holding company connects directly to the ownership thesis. The NFL's restrictions on active player ownership apply to players as individuals holding direct franchise equity. The restrictions are designed to prevent the obvious competitive integrity problems that arise when a player has a financial stake in the team he plays for or in teams he competes against. Those restrictions are real and they are enforced. But they were written with a specific model of player ownership in mind, specifically the model of a player going directly to an ownership group and purchasing an equity stake in their own name. They were not written comprehensively enough to address a player whose holding company makes passive investments in other entities that are themselves capitalized enough to participate in the increasingly complex consortium structures through which NFL franchise equity is now being distributed. The royalty income flows into the holding company. The holding company makes passive equity investments across a diversified portfolio of technology companies, lifestyle brands, real estate assets, and entertainment ventures. Those investments appreciate in value over time and generate their own returns that compound alongside the royalty income flowing in from the commercial portfolio. The holding company itself becomes a capitalized entity whose overall valuation grows year by year as both the income and the appreciation compound simultaneously. And that capitalized entity is what eventually becomes positioned to participate in the sports investment vehicles, the limited partnership structures and private equity funds, through which minority stakes in NFL franchises are increasingly being distributed as the league expands its ownership rules to accommodate institutional capital. Under that structure, Shedeur's financial interest in a franchise would be separated from his active player status by multiple legal and organizational layers. He is not purchasing a piece of the Browns directly. He is not sitting in an ownership meeting making decisions about roster construction or coaching hires. He is building the entity that accumulates the capital that eventually participates in the consortium that holds the minority stake. The separation between his player identity and his investment identity is built into the structure from the foundation. And that separation is exactly what the NFL's ownership expansion is creating room for in ways that the original bylaws did not contemplate. Let us be precise about this because precision matters when you are making an argument about legal structures and their specific implications. The word loophole tends to imply something underhanded or exploitative, a technical workaround designed to circumvent the spirit of a rule while technically complying with its letter. That is not quite what is being described here. What exists is a gap between what the NFL's current ownership rules specifically prohibit and the full range of financial structures that are now available to sophisticated investors. In an era where sports franchise ownership has become significantly more institutionalized and significantly more distributed than it was when many of those rules were originally written. The NFL's current ownership bylaws are clear and unambiguous about one thing. Active players cannot hold a direct financial interest in an NFL franchise. That prohibition is clean, and it applies without exception. No active player is going to walk into an NFL ownership meeting as a direct equity holder in the franchise he plays for or in any other franchise in the league. That door is closed firmly, and the league's ownership committee enforces it consistently. The argument is not that this prohibition is somehow circumventable through clever legal drafting. It is that this prohibition is narrower than the full universe of ownership-adjacent financial participation that sophisticated modern investment structures make possible. The NFL has been systematically expanding its ownership rules over the past several years to accommodate private equity participation in franchises in ways that simply did not exist a decade ago. Institutional investors, limited partnership vehicles, consortium structures where financial participation is distributed across multiple entities with varying levels of involvement and governance rights. These are relatively new categories of permissible ownership participation that the league created to access the capital that institutional investors represent, without compromising the concentrated ownership control that the league's competitive structure requires. Those new categories were not created with active player participation in mind, but they were also not written with specific prohibitions against the indirect, multi-layered, passive investment structures that Shedeur's financial team is reportedly examining. The gap that reportedly exists is this: an active player's holding company making a passive equity investment in a private equity fund that itself holds a limited partnership stake in an NFL franchise is a financial arrangement that is meaningfully different from an active player directly holding franchise equity. The player's involvement is passive, indirect, and mediated by multiple organizational layers that create genuine legal and operational separation. Whether that arrangement falls within the existing prohibitions or outside them is a question that the NFL's ownership committee has not definitively answered, because the question has not been formally presented in the specific form that Shedeur's structure would present it. That ambiguity is not a loophole in the exploitative sense. It is a frontier that the league's own expansion of ownership categories has created, and that sophisticated financial planning is now positioned to explore. The critically important additional element here is that the NFL's ownership trajectory is itself moving in the direction that makes this pathway more viable over time rather than less. The league is not contracting its ownership rules. It is expanding them. Every expansion creates new categories of permissible participation. Every new category creates new questions about the boundaries between what is permitted and what is not. And the financial team working on Shedeur's long-term positioning is not betting on the current rules as written. They are building toward the rules that the NFL's own institutional investor-friendly trajectory is in the process of creating. By the time the league's ownership committee gets around to writing comprehensive rules about whether an active player's holding company can participate indirectly in a franchise stake through a private equity vehicle, the capital that would fund that participation is being accumulated right now through royalty income, compounding inside a private holding structure. Let us ground the ownership thesis in numbers, because the vision without the math is just inspiration, and inspiration without capitalization does not buy franchise equity. NFL franchise valuations in 2026 are sitting in a range of $5 to $8 billion for most markets. The elite markets, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, are at the higher end of that range and trending upward. The mid-market franchises are toward the lower end, but still representing enormous asset values that have appreciated consistently over every significant time horizon you could examine. These are among the most reliably appreciating major asset classes in American finance, and their valuations reflect that track record. A minority stake in an NFL franchise, typically defined as something in the range of 5 to 10% of franchise equity, requires capitalization somewhere between $250 million at the low end for a smaller market franchise, and $800 million at the high end for a premium market team. That is the range of capital required to participate in franchise ownership at the minority stake level that the league's expanded ownership rules are making available to institutional and consortium investors. And that number, whichever point in that range you focus on, is a number that no quarterback in NFL history has earned through playing salary alone during a single playing career. The highest paid quarterbacks in the league today are earning somewhere in the range of $50 to $60 million per year in total compensation at peak contract value. Over a 10-year window of peak earning that represents $500 to $600 million in gross salary before taxes, agent fees, and the consumption expenses that come with operating at that income level. The net accumulation from salary alone over a decade of elite quarterback earnings does not get you to a meaningful minority franchise stake, even before accounting for investment returns on accumulated savings. The math of salary-based wealth accumulation simply does not produce the kind of capital required for franchise equity participation without a dramatically different income architecture running alongside it. Royalty income changes that calculation in ways that matter specifically for the ownership thesis. A royalty portfolio, generating $8 to $12 million per year from multiple independent commercial relationships, represents a substantially more durable and financially significant income stream than its face value suggests when you understand how that income gets evaluated by the investment banks and private equity firms that structure major asset acquisitions. That income is predictable. It is diversified across multiple commercial relationships rather than dependent on a single employer. It does not terminate if Shedeur suffers an injury or if a team decides to move in a different direction. It compounds independently of his football career trajectory. And when financial institutions are evaluating a buyer's capitalization for a significant equity purchase, they weight that kind of income differently and more favorably than employment income of equivalent size. The holding company that receives the royalty income and deploys it into appreciating equity positions across technology, real estate, lifestyle brands, and entertainment creates a compounding mechanism that the salary income alone cannot replicate. The royalty comes in. The holding company invests it in assets that appreciate. The appreciated assets generate their own returns. Those returns get reinvested. Over a 10 to 15-year horizon, that compounding produces a capital accumulation trajectory that looks significantly different from the linear salary accumulation that represents the ceiling for most athletes. The math is not easy, and it is not guaranteed, but it is not impossible in the way that salary-only wealth accumulation makes franchise ownership impossible. And the difference between those two assessments is the entire argument. Here is the layer of this story that pure financial analysis does not fully capture, but that is essential for understanding why the ownership thesis is more viable for Shedeur specifically than it would be for a generic athlete with equivalent financial resources. The commercial value that Shedeur generates for the franchises he plays for and the league he plays in is not passive. It is not background noise that happens to benefit the teams associated with him. It is an active, measurable, significant contribution to the broadcast revenue, sponsor revenue, and demographic engagement that defines the commercial health of the NFL ecosystem. And right now, he is generating all of that value as an employee rather than as a stakeholder. Every game Shedeur plays in Cleveland generates broadcast viewership numbers that flow directly into the league's revenue-sharing infrastructure. The national broadcast deals that fund every franchise in the league are priced based on projected viewership, and viewership is driven substantially by the presence of compelling individual talent that casual audiences tune in to watch. A quarterback with Shedeur's level of public recognition and cultural relevance contributes to those viewership numbers in ways that translate into real dollars flowing through the league's financial system. He is not just playing football. He is generating the audience that makes the broadcast rights worth what the networks pay for them. The sponsor partnerships he activates through his independent commercial platform create brand awareness that benefits the teams associated with him in ways that extend beyond the standard jersey and arena branding. When Shedeur's audience engages with a commercial partner through his personal channels, that audience is being introduced to brands and products in a context that carries his personal credibility and his cultural authority. That is a form of commercial value that the Cleveland Browns benefit from simply by having him on their roster. His commercial platform reaches the young, culturally engaged demographic that every NFL team's commercial department is spending significant resources to attract and retain. He is delivering that demographic as an employee. He is not receiving equity credit for doing so. The holding company structure he is building is specifically designed to convert that employee-level value creation into stakeholder-level equity participation over time. The former athletes who tried to become NFL owners in previous generations were attempting entry from a position of declining leverage. Their playing careers were over. Their platform value was diminishing. The commercial relationships that generated their income during their playing years were winding down. They were trying to purchase ownership with accumulated savings from a position where their primary source of leverage, their current relevance and their platform value, was already behind them. The negotiating position of a retired athlete seeking ownership is fundamentally weaker than the negotiating position of an active athlete at the peak of his commercial relevance. Shedeur is attempting entry while the leverage is at its maximum. That timing is not accidental. It is the strategy. The history of athletes attempting to move into professional sports ownership is a history of nearly universal frustration, punctuated by a very small number of exceptional cases that required either exceptional wealth accumulation or exceptional circumstances that cannot be replicated through planning. Most athletes who have dreamed about ownership have found that the dream collides with two hard realities. The capital required is significantly larger than their playing career earnings produce, and the league's ownership structures are designed to maintain control within a relatively small group of legacy owners who benefit from keeping the barriers to entry high. Michael Jordan's path to NBA ownership through the Charlotte Hornets is the most cited exception, and it is instructive precisely because of how exceptional his circumstances were. Jordan's playing career earnings and endorsement income were at a level that no other athlete in the history of team sports had achieved to that point. His Nike royalty relationship specifically, which was structured in ways that produced ongoing income rather than flat fee endorsements, generated the kind of compounding commercial return that made the capital accumulation required for ownership actually achievable. And even with all of that, the path took years of patient capital building and required specific ownership circumstances in Charlotte that made his entry possible. Jordan's success is not a template that most athletes can follow because most athletes do not have Jordan-level commercial relationships, generating Jordan-level ongoing income. What the NIL era created for Shedeur that no previous athlete generation had access to is the ability to begin building royalty-based commercial relationships years earlier in the wealth accumulation timeline than was previously possible. Jordan built his royalty income after reaching professional superstardom. The commercial relationships that generated his ongoing Nike returns were products of his NBA peak years. Shedeur began building royalty-structured commercial relationships before he played a single professional snap. The NIL era created the legal and commercial framework for college athletes to establish meaningful commercial portfolios, and Shedeur used that framework from Colorado to build the foundation of the royalty architecture that now continues compounding through his professional career. That earlier start on the compounding timeline is not a minor advantage. In the mathematics of compound growth, the difference between starting the compounding process 5 years earlier versus 5 years later is not a 5-year difference in outcomes. It is a dramatically larger difference because the early years of compounding establish the base on which every subsequent year of returns is calculated. A royalty portfolio that has been compounding for 15 years produces significantly more than a royalty portfolio that has been compounding for 10 years even if the annual income from both is identical. Shedeur's NIL head start on the compounding timeline is potentially worth more to the ultimate ownership thesis than the equivalent amount of additional salary income he could have earned by being a first-round pick rather than a fifth-round pick. The earlier compounding start and the ongoing royalty architecture are the structural advantages that separate his ownership thesis from the dreams of ownership that previous athlete generations could not convert into reality. Here is where the analysis arrives at a specific and documentable conclusion, rather than remaining in the territory of financial theory and strategic observation. The prediction is this: by 2035, Shedeur Sanders will hold a documented equity position in a professional sports franchise, not a ceremonial stake gifted by a grateful franchise owner who wants the association with his name, not a small symbolic interest that represents a marketing relationship rather than a genuine financial position. A purchase position, built through a decade of royalty income compounding inside a private holding structure, deployed into appreciating equity positions across multiple asset classes, and ultimately channeled through the consortium and limited partnership vehicles that the NFL's own ownership expansion is creating as the pathway for institutional capital to enter franchise ownership. The timeline from here to there requires specific things to go right, and it is worth being honest about the conditions that the prediction depends on. Shedeur needs to perform at a level on the football field that sustains and grows the commercial platform, whose royalty income funds the entire architecture. A quarterback who does not develop into a legitimate NFL starter does not maintain the commercial relevance that the royalty portfolio requires to keep generating meaningful income. The football performance is not separable from the financial strategy. It is the foundation on which the commercial value is built. Without the football performance, there is no platform, and without the platform, there is no royalty income generating the capital that funds the ownership path. The league's ownership rule evolution needs to continue in the direction that creates the specific pathways through which the holding company structure can participate in franchise equity. That evolution has been moving in the right direction, and the institutional capital pressure that is driving it is not going away. But rule changes at the NFL ownership committee level move slowly, and with significant input from legacy owners who benefit from maintaining high barriers to entry. The pathway that Shedeur's financial team is building toward depends on rules that are being created in real time, rather than rules that currently exist in complete form. What makes the prediction more than speculation despite those dependencies is the combination of factors that Shedeur has assembled that no previous athlete in his position has assembled simultaneously. The royalty-structured commercial relationships rather than flat-fee endorsements. The private holding company accumulating and deploying that income systematically. The NIL-era head start on the compounding timeline that provides a foundation no previous generation of athletes had access to at an equivalent career stage. The NFL's own institutional investor expansion, creating the structural pathways that the holding company is being positioned to eventually access. And the platform value that continues generating commercial leverage, as long as the football performance sustains the public relevance that underpins everything else. The league does not have a comprehensive framework for the specific structure Shedeur is building toward. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a problem. It is the point. The most powerful financial positions are the ones you establish before the market builds a framework to contain them. By the time the NFL's ownership committee sits down to write comprehensive rules about whether an active player's holding company can participate in franchise equity through a private equity intermediary, the capital that would fund that participation will have been accumulating for years. The answer to the question may ultimately be no. The rules may be written in a way that closes the pathway before Shedeur's structure reaches the capitalization required to access it. But the answer might also be yes, or something more complex than a simple yes or no, in ways that create the documented equity position that the prediction anticipates. What Shedeur said deserves to be heard one more time as the closing frame for everything this analysis has laid out. He said he is the most guaranteed risk you could take. He was talking about himself as a quarterback prospect. But the statement applies with equal precision to the financial thesis being built around his name, his royalty income, his holding company, and his ownership ambition. The guaranteed risk is not that the path is certain. It is that the work being done to walk it is real, systematic, and already further along than the people who have been focused exclusively on the football story have recognized. The spotlight has always been on the player. The work has always been happening in the structure underneath. That is the whole game. And by the time most people catch up to what is actually being built, the foundation will already be in place. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think an active NFL player can realistically build toward franchise ownership through this kind of financial architecture? Or is the NFL's ownership structure too insulated for this pathway to actually open up? Let us talk about it.